Then, the next interesting thing that happened at Mount St. Helens. When the mountain initially blew up, of course we had that mudslide that came off the north slope of Mount St. Helens. That mudslide hit Spirit Lake, and it created this huge wave of water that hit the other side of the mountain, uprooted all those trees, brought all those trees back into Spirit Lake. Well, now all those trees are floating around. Now, from what I could tell, the last time I was there at Mount St. Helens in 2012, I would say most of these logs now that have been floating around on Spirit Lake and that have been bumping up against one another, most of them now have been waterlogged, and they have landed at the bottom of the lake. Some of them have actually planted themselves at the bottom of the lake, where the root end goes down first and plants themselves. And so all we need now is another catastrophe to bury all those logs. And under the right conditions, those logs can become petrified, just like what we see at the Arizona Petrified Forest. Now you go to the Arizona Petrified Forest, which I have been there, and all these trees, thousands of trees just laying around, and they're not really trees anymore, they're petrified logs just laying around. Now that's the same thing that we could see at Mount St. Helens if there could be another eruption, another catastrophe that would bury all those logs and fossilize them or petrify them. One day then another event could come along and then uncover all those logs, and then voila, you got petrified logs, just like you have at the Arizona Petrified Forest. Okay, so the Arizona Petrified Forest is made up of mostly all volcanic material, and we believe that the volcano that created all this ash actually came down from Mexico, because you can trace the ash where it came from, and it buried all these trees up there in Arizona and petrified them. So this would have been sometime during the flood, the flood event of Noah. And we find petrified forests all over the world. In fact, right here in the state of Washington, we have one of the top 10 petrified forests in the world, called Ginkgo Petrified Forest. The only thing is, it's not really a forest at all. It's a place where, once again, where trees were uprooted from somewhere, and they floated around and then got buried, in this case, by basalt. And it was actually the basalt that petrified the trees, in this case. So the point is, what we're seeing here, people, is not slow, gradual uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism is the belief that the present is the key to the past. That whatever is happening now happened millions of years ago. Well, that's bunk. Because just because you see a car going down the highway 60 miles an hour doesn't mean it's always been going 60 miles an hour. Just because you see a car driving down the highway northbound doesn't mean it's always been going northbound. At some point, it can turn off on an exit and end up going east or west. Okay? So just because of what you see happening right now does not prove it's always been happening that way. Right now, yes, it is true. Like, for example, the Colorado River. It's moving sand grains, one particle at a time, but that doesn't prove that it's always been doing that. There are catastrophes that have happened in Earth history, and it's pretty well been proven that, yes, there was a universal flood that caused all the catastrophe that we see here in the world. When you look at the world, you look at all the geology in the world today, we don't see examples of uniformitarianism that created all these canyons and all these mountains. What caused that was catastrophism, not slow, gradual uniformitarianism. And all these canyons, all these mountains, all these fossils, whatever did all that, we're not seeing that happen today. All the sedimentary layers that we see all around the world. The whole Earth is covered, two-thirds of the planet is covered by sedimentary layers. And the event that created those layers is not happening today. And so, see, uniformitarianism is not always correct. Now, like right now, we're kind of under a uniformitarianism effect, but not in the past. In the past, it's been catastrophism. And of course, as you look at these pictures of the Arizona petrified forest, it's amazing to see this. And so today, we've got all these logs at Spirit Lake, and they are getting waterlogged, and they float to the bottom. And some of these logs are floating straight up. They're floating vertically, and they will replant themselves at the bottom of the lake. And so scientists estimate that there are 20,000 trees in the bottom of Spirit Lake. Now, this was many years ago when they made this estimate. Many of them are buried upright, and some are already 15 feet deep in sediments. They seem to settle out based upon the species of the tree, the type of a tree, giving the appearance of a complete forest. Now, all over the world, we find what are called polystrate trees. Now, poly means many. Straight means stratified. So these trees, they're buried vertical, and they're stratified layers that have buried these trees. So the evolutionists will say, well, these trees have been like that for millions of years, buried in an upright position. So you're telling me that a tree was buried in an upright position where sedimentary layers slowly covered the tree over millions of years? Well, that's hogwash, because that tree would have deteriorated before it ever got buried. You see, that's why, this evolutionary uniformitarianism is just, it's a laughing stock. Even a kindergartner can understand this kind of stuff. So we find polystrat trees all over the world. And then we find standing petrified trees found in Yellowstone National Park. And it's interesting because at Yellowstone National Park, we have this petrified forest, and the evolutionists are saying that there are 27 different layers of fossil forests at Specimen Ridge in Yellowstone. 27 different layers. They're saying that the bottom layer is a fossil forest. Then you go to the second layer is a fossil forest, and the third layer, they say that there's 27 of those layers. And those layers were all created over millions of years. Well, now after Mount St. Helens eruption, the evolutionists got embarrassed, and they took this plaque away. It's no longer there, where it says, across the valley rise the slopes of Specimen Ridge. But the forest you see there today is only the latest chapter in a remarkable story. Buried within the volcanic rocks that compose the mountain are 27 distinct layers of fossil forest that flourished 50 million years ago. They took that plaque away since the eruption of Mount St. Helens, because we learned that each one of those so-called layers of petrified forests are not there. They don't exist. And we've proven that now, because scientists have gone in there and they have dug at the bottom of each one of these trees at different layers. So they dug at the base of the petrified tree and found out that, guess what? The root system is not there. So what does that say? Okay, so all these trees were uprooted from somewhere else, and just like at Spirit Lake at Mount St. Helens, all these trees were uprooted in a catastrophe, and then they were all buried upright. And so we now know that these so-called 27 distinct layers are not layers at all. This is just one complete event where they were all buried. And then another event comes along and exposes all this. Another catastrophic event comes along and exposes all these trees that have been replanted and have become fossilized. Very interesting. Excuse me, doesn't it take millions of years to form coal? Well, let's talk about that. Fossil fuels, coal and oil. Well, first of all, coal, there are many huge coal deposits around the world. One of them is in the United States. Coal seams runs from Kansas to Pennsylvania. That's a huge coal seam. Most people have been taught that coal forms slowly in swamps over millions of years, but updated scientific evidence now says otherwise. Many plants found in coal would not grow in swamps. Compressed swamp material is a chaotic jumble of plant remains. Coal comes in neatly separated layers. The root stems, leaves, and pollen of swamp plants tend to stay together. Plants in coal are torn apart and separated into different layers, so much so that roots, stems, leaves, pollen, and seeds in coal were given separate scientific names before scientists, after many years, discovered they were really the shredded and separated remains of the same plant. And so, see, coal is formed quickly, not over millions of years. And so the evolutionists, they say, well, coal came from swamps. No, they didn't come from swamps, because what we find in coal is not what we find in swamps. And what we find in the swamps is not what we find in coal. In fact, I have been to places in Montana, and oh man, I've been to so many places now, but I've actually seen a coal layer in the Badlands in Montana where I was digging for dinosaur bones, and this coal seam, I'm going to say it was about, that thick in the Badlands in Montana, and that coal seam went for miles and miles and miles. Well, a coal seam that is laid down like pancakes is like perfect pancake-like structure. That doesn't represent a swamp. That's ridiculous. Okay? I mean, I'm just going to call it what it is. It's dumb. And so, no, this coal was formed quickly. Now, let's talk about oil. Well, oil, bacteria forms some oil. In fact, you have olive oil, liver oil, corn oil, cod liver oil. You have all these different kinds of oils, but the truth is, people, all you have to do is take something that's dead and smash it, and you can get oil out of it. If you smash it hard enough, you can get instant oil out of it. It doesn't take millions of years to create oil, because oil is already there. So all you have to do is take a human being, smash the human being hard enough, and if you do it hard enough, you can actually get oil to come out of a person. Or out of any kind of vegetable type matter, you can get oil because it's already there. It didn't have to form, it's there. And so, anyway, Dr. Steve Austin, he worked on this floating map model for the origin of coal. And now, he has discovered from a national lab, has shown that coal can be formed by heating wood, clay, and water at 150 degrees centigrade for 36 weeks. See, so coal can even be made in the lab in a short period of time. Coal can form at the bottom of Spirit Lake if we just have another catastrophic event that covers all that material down at the bottom of Spirit Lake, you know, where the trees have been rubbing against each other and you've got bark and all this material that goes to the bottom. So all we need now is another event, a catastrophic event, to bury all that and to create enough heat. And everything's got to be right, of course, and you could form coal in a short period of time. In fact, you go to Yellowstone, and now this kind of goes off subject a little bit, but just to show you that, you know, coal, for example, it could be considered a fossil because it was made up of dead things. All right, well, if you take a tree, a piece of bark or whatever, throw it in one of those pools at Yellowstone where it's highly saturated with minerals, and the wood will turn to stone in a very short period of time. See, it doesn't take millions of years to form a fossil. It doesn't take millions of years to form coal, oil, petrified wood. It takes just a short period of time. Now, that's what we see from observation. Fossils should remind us of God's sin. When we see a fossil like what you see here on this table, and you know, you look at this trilobite here, these trilobites from Africa, when you look at the amazing detail and definition of these fossils, they're so well defined. That means that they didn't just lay around for an extended period of time and get slowly covered up by mud. No, these fossils were instantly covered. They were catastrophically covered. They did not die. They woke up dead. They were killed in a catastrophe. Some people, they'll look at these fossils and they'll say, oh, well, how did they die? Well, what makes you think they died? Well, they didn't die. They were killed. They woke up dead. I mean, they were instantly covered. You know, look at the fish fossils that we find today in rock stores, rock and fossil stores. You'll notice that the fins are extracted. When a fish dies, the fin relaxes, it goes down. But fins on fossil fish, they're always extracted. They're in the swimming position. That's why when I go to a rock and fossil store, I always go up to the store owner and I say, hey, have you ever noticed something really interesting about your fish fossils? All of your fish fins, they're all in the extracted position. That proves that they were swimming when they were killed. I mean, they were instantly buried. And I'm going to tell you something. As soon as you ask the question, it's interesting that your fish fossils, the fins are in the up position, and immediately they know exactly what you're talking about, and they basically turn their back on you. They don't want to talk about that. I've had many conversations like that. One time I was riding in a bus with a guy sitting next to me. He was a scientist that worked out at Hanford, and he saw my dinosaur t-shirt, and so we started talking about dinosaur fossils, and I said, yeah, I've hunted dinosaur fossils in Montana, and I've taken a group of people to go fossil hunting for dinosaur bones. And I said, you know, it was really interesting because we actually found dinosaur fossils with turtle fossils and crocodile and alligator fossils. And boy, as soon as I said that, he turned around like this and he didn't want to talk anymore because he knew what I was getting at. He knew that the geologic column of the evolutionists is wrong and it's incomplete, because finding turtle fossils with dinosaur fossils and finding petrified wood and other organisms that we found in there, that doesn't go along with the Bible of the evolutionists, which is the geologic column. And so when we look at fossils, we're looking at catastrophism, not slow, gradual burial, not where the animal dies. Now, having said all that, remember the guy by the name of Harry Truman? Well, he was warned that Mount St. Helens was about to erupt. And he did not heed that warning. And Harry Truman says, oh, if that mountain erupts, if it even does erupt, there's not enough material to come down there to bury me. And so he did not heed the warning, and so Harry was buried. Harry was buried. And he was killed instantly, and not to make fun, but there's a good chance that he could end up being a fossil. Now, the Bible says in 1 Thessalonians 5:2, it says, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. You see, he's going to come when people are least expecting him to come back. For when they shall say peace and safety, ooh, peace and safety. Don't we hear a lot about peace and safety? We hear about it way more today than we did 100 years ago. In fact, the interesting thing is that World War I was the war to end all wars, and the more they talked about peace and safety, then there was more wars. And so they had formed the League of Nations to try to bring world peace, and since World War I started, and it was the war to end all wars, they changed the word League of Nations to United Nations, and then the United Nations ended up, it didn't seem to help much, because then we entered into World War II, and then Adolf Hitler was supposed to bring peace, and he's kind of likened like the Antichrist in a way, because he was telling everybody, well, I'm going to bring peace, and I'm going to fix Germany and all of its problems, and then he ended up going on a murder spree, killing over 6 million people. And so, see, the more that people talk about peace and safety, the worse things get. And then in 1 Thessalonians 5:3, it says, for when they shall say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. You see, the Bible talks about birth pangs. See, the woman knows that she's getting closer to giving birth as the birth pangs get closer and closer together. And we're seeing that today in world history. One thing I don't like, and it kind of shows some naiveness of some of us believers, when we liken this virus now that's going around the world, and the whole world now is pretty much shut down. In fact, this virus is doing more to affect this world than World War I or World War II. It's got everybody in a panic. It's gone literally worldwide. And you got people saying, well, you know, we've experienced stuff like this before. No, we haven't experienced stuff like this before. We've never experienced where a disease or a virus would shut down the whole world, where it would affect everybody, and also all the viruses that have gone through and killed like millions of people. You know, we know about like the Spanish plague and, you know, all the different plagues that took place, the Black Plague and the bubonic plague and all that. The governments of the world never turned those plagues into something political. Yeah, think about that one. You see, this so-called plague, this so-called virus, and it's really not a plague because they're overemphasizing the whole thing. But this, they are using this plague now to start tracking people. No plague has ever done that. No government has ever tried to take a virus, turn it into a plague, and then turn it into something political where now we're going to start tracking people. Now they're starting to talk more about the microchip, the implant, and put it into somebody and start scanning people. They've never done that over a virus. They've never done that over a plague before. We're seeing the birth pangs getting closer and closer and closer. Now, I'm not making any predictions, and I'm not saying when the Lord is coming back. I don't know when Jesus is coming back. I just know this, that every day it's getting closer. And it does appear that we're seeing these birth pangs. And another birth pang that we're seeing is the amazing deception that we're seeing today. We are seeing deception that is unprecedented. You know, I always like to use the example, compare the Old Testament with the New Testament, and I think I'm on to something here. But you know, when you look at the Old Testament, you look at the level of deception in the Old Testament. Now, there was deception, but nothing like now. I mean, the Bible talks a lot about deception. I'm going to show all the Bible verses here. But the Bible talks about deception as one of the birth pangs that we're going to see before Christ comes back. And the deception is unprecedented. Like when you look at the Old Testament, for example, I always get a big kick out of this. Because when you look at the people in the Old Testament, when they wanted to worship an idol, what did they do? They found a rock, they cut down a tree, got a chunk of wood, they carved an image out of it, and they worshipped it. Or, as in the other story, you know about them taking all their jewelry, their earrings, melting it down, turning it into a golden calf, and they said, well, we're worshiping this golden calf. This golden calf is what's delivering us from all of our problems. Well, you know, nobody does that anymore, except for maybe some people in the dark, deep jungles. They might be doing something like that. But you know what? We don't do that anymore because today we are more sophisticated and we are more clever. You see, sophistication and cleverness is associated with deception. So instead of us now carving out an image out of rock or wood, no, what we do as far as worshiping something, we find some sport or some hobby, something that's going to elevate us, make me look good. I mean, how many people today go and get a camera and their favorite thing to do is to take selfies? Ooh, I really like myself, but I will never admit that I'm worshiping myself because no, we're too sophisticated for that. We're too clever. Today we've got politicians who have learned the sophistication of cleverness and deception. I mean, it's like we're learning how to deceive. We're studying it out. We're turning it into a philosophy. We're turning it into a science, so to speak. And so today, politicians, lawyers have become very clever. It's like a person I once heard say, oh, I'm not judging, I'm just making an observation. Ah, see, that's being clever. That's being sophisticated. That's taking words and manipulating them. See, we're living in the time of incredible deception. Deception that we have never seen before. And so what we do, and I'm not against sports or hobbies, but just get the point. Today, instead of falling down and worshiping some carved out image in a stone. Today we worship our sports, our hobbies, ourselves, our money. We do things to try to make ourselves look good. Way more so than they did in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, it was almost like they were honest about their sin. They would just come out and admit to it. It's interesting when you read about some of the wicked kings in the Old Testament, they would actually admit, like Nebuchadnezzar, if I remember it right, the story, Nebuchadnezzar, he even admitted who the real God of heaven was, but I'm just going to continue to worship my own gods. You see, he was just very upfront about it. Today, we're very deceptive about worshiping false gods. We don't actually say, well, I'm worshiping some God that I know doesn't exist. We don't do that anymore. Today we're really into worshiping ourselves, worshiping money, and we don't admit that we're worshiping it. And we've learned to become very sophisticated and clever with our idol worship. You see, so today we are in unprecedented deceptive times. And anyway, in John chapter 10, verse 9, it says, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. And so see, there's only one way to God, and that is through Jesus Christ. The Bible says there's no intermediary between God and man except Jesus. And so we go to Jesus for our salvation. And in Psalms 90:12 it says, so teach us to number our days. See, we're to number our days. And today, the other part of deception is that, we don't want to talk about Bible prophecy because it's too controversial. Well, who is giving you that thought? You know how many preachers today are saying, well, we don't want to talk about Bible prophecy. We don't want to talk about the one world government, the one world leader, the one world religion. We don't want to talk about the microchip that could possibly be one day becoming the mark. And I'm not saying that the chip is the mark. I'm just saying we're going that way. I'm the kind of person who connects the dots. I believe that A leads to B, B leads to C, and C leads to D. So we're seeing similarities. We're seeing things happen that would lead a reasonable person who is studied into the Word of God, that we're getting closer to Christ's return. We're seeing things gradually fulfilled in Bible prophecy. But today we've got preachers who will say, well, no, we don't want to talk about any of this because this is too controversial. Who gave you that idea? Do you think God would give you that idea? No, that would be the devil. The devil gave you that idea. The devil is implanting those false ideas into your mind because the devil doesn't want anybody to be ready for Christ's coming. See, the whole idea behind Bible prophecy is to get people on their toes and to say, well, you know what? Jesus is coming back. Well, I better be sure that I'm ready for Jesus before he comes back. I better be sure that I'm living for him. No, instead, like in Matthew chapter 24, it says, people are just going to be behaving like as if there's no God, there's no Jesus. We're creating our own designer religions, and we're trying to feel good about church, and just give me a feel-good message. Just say something to make me feel good today. And that's where we're at. We don't want anything convicting. We want no conviction. We don't want sin to be taught. We don't want to ever say that, well, God is bringing about this judgment. And really, I do believe that COVID-19 is a judgment from God. I said it, yes. I do believe that COVID-19 is a judgment from God, and God is trying to get people to repent. God is trying to get people to get their priorities straight. I could talk about 9/11, compare that to COVID-19, and all that's happened since then. I really don't have the time to do that right now. So that'll be a whole nother lesson. But we're seeing the birth pains. They're getting closer together. And in Deuteronomy 32:29, it says, oh, that they were wise, that they understood this, that they would consider their latter end. See, the devil doesn't want you to consider your latter end. He doesn't want you to think that, you know what, times are getting short, maybe I better get right with God. No, the devil doesn't want us to think that way. He wants us to think that, well, I have time. well, that Bible prophecy stuff is just too controversial. You know, and it's interesting because you have creation on one side of the Bible, you have Bible prophecy on the other extreme side of the Bible, and then you have everything in between. Don't you think that we're supposed to study from the end, from the beginning to the end, and the end to the beginning? You know, hint, hint, hint. You know, I think the Lord is trying to tell us something here. Okay, well, that was a rather short presentation on Mount St. Helens. And I'm glad that I got to share this with you. I know that many of you have already heard this before. And I appreciate Dr. Steve Austin doing all the work that he's done on studying Mount St. Helens and how it has become a geological laboratory for studying Noah's flood. Also, don't forget the trip to Mount St. Helens. Don't forget the trip. Look, if you can go, if you have the time and you have the money, you need to go. I wish I could go. It just turns out the very week that they're having this trip, I already have other priorities I have to do. And so it's kind of a bummer because I really wanted to go on this trip. And those of you who are watching this and you're going to get to go, please go and have fun because it is a ball. Because you're going to get to be around some really great people, hear really great information. It's going to be very inspiring. I've got a lot of good memories at Mount St. Helens. With the different trips I've taken there and the field trips that I've taken there through Dr. Steve Austin. And so anyway, all right, have a good day, and I'm signing out.